Hello, this is Dr. Dennis Bielfeldt of the Christ School of Theology and the Institute of Lutheran Theology. We're talking today about medieval semantic theory, and this is the last lecture called a primer of medieval semantic theory. We're talking today about supposition theory, and last time I distinguished among material supposition, simple supposition, and personal supposition, and then started to talk about ways in which a personal supposition was itself divided up. And so William of Ockham, of course, who is a real master at this, distinguished determinate supposition. And according to Ockham, one can descend validly from the proposition to the complete disjunction of singulars with respect to that term, and ascend validly from any singular. Okay. So that was supposed to be the identity condition for a determinate supposition. Confused supposition, well, that's if it's not determinate. Okay. And confused and distributed supposition is when one can validly descend from the proposition to the indefinite conjunction of singulars with respect to that term. Now, if all of this is very confusing to you, I've tried to make this more clear here. Number one, if you can follow through, I'm not a very good writer, okay, so I'm sorry about that. Probably a reason I never became a mathematician. No one would ever know what I scrawled on the board. But anyway, one, which is running downhill, it looks like, it says that X, anything that has a certain property P, implies that A has that property, B has that property, up to N has that property. That's everything in the domain has that property. And when that occurs, and no particular thing would imply that this has the property, that X has a property, no PA, PB, or PN implies PX. Then we have an example of what's called confused and distributed supposition. So hopefully I'm not confused here. This is confused and distributed. Now, if saying that X, something has the property P, implies that A has it, or perhaps B has it, or C has it, up to N has it, and each and every thing that has it implies that some X has it, we are now talking about determinate supposition. So the first is confused and distributed, and the second is determinate. See, this is really quite foreign to how we think today. You can see echoes of how we think in some of this, but this is a different way of doing things. Then we have down here the so-called, here again, Ockham is now going to do, he's distinguished confused and distributed from determinate, and now we're going to call this the merely confused, and in merely confused supposition, that something has P does not imply that A has P or B has P all the way up to N has P, but it does imply that the disjunction, that P is true of the disjunction. And to explain this involves us in some interesting reflections. It does claim that if A has P, or B has P, or N has P, then of course some X has P. This is a distinction here. I'm using this in a way that's not used in precisely the same way over here. We're talking about a situation in which this obtains, or that obtains, or that obtains. And for Occam, that was different from the situation when the entire disjunction obtained. Okay. Well, this is as far as we can go into this matter right now. But I do want to now show you the square of opposition. You remember the square of opposition, and you remember A, right? All W's have M. Think of W's as whales and M as mammals. Okay, accordingly, we would say that in the square of opposition, we would have to take the subject as having confused and distributed supposition, right? Now that goes to the conjunction. And the predicate has merely confused supposition. If that is true, then all W R M holds. W stands for each object in the domain, while M stands for some disjunction of objects in the domain. I have to leave this up here, so you're going to have to remember in your minds that an A proposition is the proposition all W's are M. The E proposition, if you remember, it goes from here, A to E. No W's are M. According to Occam, we have to understand the supposition of an E proposition to be one in which the subject and predicate are both confused and distributed. So if you think this through, it certainly would hold that W and M are disjunct when you give both the predicate and the subject confused and distributed personal supposition. W stands for each object in the domain, and M also stands for each object in the domain. Now, if we go down to the I proposition, here we have some W's are M. And what is held here is that we must give both the subject and the predicate of some W's are M. We must give that a reading of determinate personal supposition. W stands for some objects or other in the domain, and so does M. Now the tricky one is O. O propositions are some W's are not M. So here now the subject is supposed to have determinate supposition, and the predicate has confused and distributed supposition. Subject has determinate supposition. Okay, so W stands for some objects or other in the domain, but M stands for each and every object in the domain. And so then that turns out to be a reading of the semantics of the square of opposition, which makes it come out correctly. Okay, the fate of copulation. Well, we're talking about semantic theory. We're not talking about baby making in the 13th century, in the 14th century. Earlier in the tradition, copulation was applied to the supposition of predicate terms. And of course, William of Sherwood said that substantive names and pronouns supposit, but adjectives, participles, and verbs copulate. Okay. So copulation was a type of personal supposition. But the use of this term copulation fades by the 14th century because it's really a special case of supposition. We have ampliation and restriction. A term like albus, this is interesting. I got to erase all of this. Now we need somebody coming in here erasing the blackboard. That'd be fun. A term like albus can be applied to homo. Okay, so you have homo. Homo is a human being, right? So if I apply the name albus to that, I'm restricting the supposition of homo, which is to white men and women, homo is to all men and women. I'm now restricting it because this is masculine. That means a white male. So of the class of all men and women, I've now restricted it to white men. If I put alba up here, I've restricted it to white women, right? alba. That's how it worked. See, so I mean, this semantic theory was really built around Latin. Only general terms have personal supposition that can be ampliated or restricted. So you have to have a word like homo that can be ampliated or restricted. The past tense can ampliate a term to the past, and the present, and past and present supposita. So a verb can cause ampliation and restriction of its reference. A modal term can ampliate to possible and actual suppositia. If I talk about possible men, that's a larger class than actual men. Supposition is to many more people. Okay, there were counterintuitive results from all this. We normally reason from actuality to possibility. That is to say, if A is B, then A can be B. If A is actual, then A is possible. But this does not follow when ampliating with modal terms. A can be B means that everything that can be A can be B. But even if A is B is true, it may not be the case that everything that can be A can also be B. Now you're saying, what in the heck are you talking about, Bielfeldt? Okay, take, for instance, the sun lights the world. Okay, so that's true. But it is not true that every planet lighting our hemisphere can be the sun. So the moon lights cannot be the sun lights. The moon cannot be the sun. So you end up with, although the sun lights the moon is true, you might end up saying that it's, when you substitute in another thing, that this would, on the surface of it, it would seem like that we should be, there is something that lights the world, but it turns out that this doesn't work well, okay. I'm going to say one more thing about these matters, and we're going to call it a quits for our primary task here of looking at medieval semantics. We're talking basically about a truth-conditional analysis as we go forward. William of Ockham and Jean Buridan develop truth conditions for categorical sentences on the basis of supposition. A universal affirmation, a universal affirmative, is true if and only if the predicate supposits for everything for which the subject supposits. So a whale is a mammal is true if and only if the predicate supposits for everything for which the subject supposits. So you can't have whale suppositing for something that mammal does not supposit for. Okay. What they assumed were that affirmative categoricals had existential import. We talked about this back when we talked about Aristotle. All whales are mammals assumes that there are whales. Now, very interestingly, the O proposition, the truth conditions seem a bit odd to us. Some man is not a Greek. Normally, I would write that as some man is not a Greek. One might say there is some man, right? And this man is not a Greek. That's an operator, and if there is some particular man and that man is not a Greek. But they analyze it as it's not the case that there is some man that's a Greek, right? And this means that some man is not a Greek is true either if there is a man that is not a Greek or if there are no men at all, right? So this works. If you assume existential import, then that works as well. So we are done with our little primary investigation into medieval semantics. That's just barely touching the surface of things, but you can see that there is plenty of fodder there for the doing of theology, that most complex of all disciplines, at least for the medieval theologians and philosophers. Thank you. This is Dr. Dennis Bielfeldt of the Institute of Lutheran Theology. We'll see you next time.